What's up, Athletics Nation? Head coach Alex Peterson here with another vlog for you guys. If you have not yet, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. We're going to be coming at you with all kinds of content designed to help you improve athletic performance, regardless of whether you're a weekend warrior trying to just improve your health, or you are an athlete trying to improve your vertical jump, speed, any athletic attribute. We're here to help you, and we are going to be a resource to you with top quality content. So along with that, something we're going to talk about today is actually not necessarily related to human performance, but is related to our progression as athletes in terms of the knowledge that we develop over our athletic careers. And so this is going to be sort of a case study of what to look for when you are digesting fitness-related content online. So here's what happened. We have an athletics Facebook group where our athletes like to share content, not only our content, but also content that they're finding elsewhere on the interwebs as well. And as typically happens, the content is 99% good. In some instances, though, the content may look really great on face value, but when we take a deeper dive into the content itself, we see that it may not be as great as it might appear to be on the surface. Let's go ahead and show you guys the post. So the main points that we want to touch on here are the fact that this person is tying an injury rate to CrossFit in support of their argument that CrossFit is a quality program for individuals to use for their training and programming and well-being. The biggest pieces of evidence that they're using from the scientific literature in this post are this injury rate. I'll read word for word. The evidence shows that the injury rate in CrossFit is 0.74 injuries per 1,000 hours and even lower for those training more at 0.27 injuries per 1,000 hours. So if you're trying to do the math in your head, that's about 1 injury every 4 years if you're doing CrossFit. He goes on to say that it's a very big challenge for him as a medical professional who advocates for CrossFit to battle his peers who are saying that CrossFit is not a quality program for people and it's more likely to get people injured than a better program that may be found elsewhere. The second statistic that becomes very important in this is his comparison to running, at which he pegs 7.7 to 17.8 injuries per 1,000 hours of running. And that becomes the key comparison here. He's saying that CrossFit has this very low injury rate while running has this very high injury rate. He goes on to say that if you are a healthcare practitioner, stop demonizing CrossFit. This also goes for every gym goer or best friend who thinks that those swimming pull-ups are dumb. Check your facts. In other words, this is factual proof that CrossFit is safer than other means of getting in shape. He uses 2 studies or articles to support his claim here. They are Fado et al., a 4-year analysis of incidence of injuries amongst CrossFit trained participants, so that we can conclude is where he's getting his CrossFit evidence from. And Videbek, so probably butchered that one, et al., incidence of running-related injuries per 1,000 hours of running in different types of runners. Lots of the uses of the word running. So what we're going to do today is dive into these articles and see, do they actually conclusively show us that CrossFit is much safer than running, or that this injury rate is substantiated by the evidence? Let's go ahead and dive into the articles. Diving into the CrossFit study, the biggest thing we're looking for is how they arrived at the statistic of 0.74 injuries per 1,000 hours in the high end and 0.27 injuries on the low end. The first thing we see as we start to look at this study is that it is a survey study. In other words, the professionals are reaching out to individuals via social media, email, so on and so forth. In this instance, trying to find people that are interested in taking the survey study that meet a certain criteria. In this case, they surveyed 3,049 people via social media, email, and word of mouth. They needed to have at least 3 months of CrossFit experience. If they met this threshold, they answered a series of questions about their participation in the sport of CrossFit or in a CrossFit training. They asked them questions about their age, experience, training frequency, and gender. And this helps them stratify the data so that if they parse the data in certain ways, they might draw conclusions about the injury rates in certain genders or in certain age groups or in certain training frequencies. True key to this study was asking them how many times they had been injured in the last 12 months. Now, for us to really get a strong understanding of what an injury is, we need to look at their definition. In this case, they defined an injury as any muscle, tendon, bone, joint, or ligament injury sustained while doing CrossFit that resulted in your consultation with a physician or healthcare provider and caused you to stop or reduce your usual physical activity, your typical participation in CrossFit, or caused you to have surgery. As we're going to come to see, in comparison to the running study, this definition of the term injury becomes very important. Now let's look a little bit further down in the study. What we end up seeing is that despite this very low injury rate, like we said, it's about 1 out of every 4 years, when we dive into how many injuries there actually were in the last 12 months, 931 out of the 3,049 people that were surveyed in this study had been injured in the last 12 months. That's over 30% of the participants. So before we even dive into the comparison between CrossFit and running, already we can look at this number, 931 out of 3,049. That's a bit jaw-dropping. That's over 30% of the participants that had sustained an injury by their definition. So let's circle back on how they arrived at this number, 0.74 per 1,000 hours. So how does that jibe with 931 out of 3,049? This is 30% of the participants or more. This is 1 out of 4 years getting injured. If I really wanted to play devil's advocate here, I could be the antithetical argument and say, well, you might think that you're only going to get injured 1 out of every 4 years. I'm telling you that you have a 30% chance of getting injured if you do CrossFit in the first 12 months. You're going to have to see a healthcare professional for that, by their definition. So it just goes to show that depending on what our argument is that we're trying to support, it's pretty easy to manipulate scientific research to support your end of the argument. First of all, they took a number of injuries, 931. Remember, this started out of 3,049. However, the researchers said we don't want to arrive out of just a number out of every participant. We want to actually be able to tell people, here's the amount of injuries you might sustain practically in the number of hours that you're training, because people train different frequencies, right? We want to account for the fact that some people don't train very frequently, some people train pretty frequently. So here's what they did. They took that 3,049 participants, and they multiplied that first by the number of training sessions in a week. Okay. In this case, that was about, on average, 4 training sessions. Then they multiplied that by the number of weeks in a year. And so as we can see, they've essentially taken what, if I looked at this just as a given statistic by itself, I would say, wow, that's kind of a high injury rate, quote unquote. They took that and tried to make it into this per 1,000 hours figure. So multiplied all these together, took it as a factor of 1,000 hours, and that is what allowed them to find that injury rate. As we're going to come to see, the way that these researchers statistically created inferences is going to be very different than how the researchers in the running article did so. Let's dive into that article. So if you'll remember, we said that running has about a 7 to 17 per 1,000 hours injury rate. So there's 7 to 17 injuries per 1,000 hours of training. And we said, wow, that's crazy in comparison to the 0.27 or 0.74, depending on which end of the spectrum you're at in the CrossFit study. So let's look at exactly what the evidence says here in this article by Videbek et al. As we're going to see, this is something called a meta-analysis. A meta-analysis is essentially taking the existing body of literature pertaining to a subject, using an inclusion criteria to decide which studies are relevant for what you're trying to look at, and then using robust statistical modeling to synthesize the data from the studies to create inferences and draw conclusions from it. In this case, 13 articles were chosen from 845 abstracts. The abstract is basically the Cliff Notes version of a study. As the researchers pointed out in this study, the number one flaw was the heterogeneity of the definition of the word injury. We came before talking about the CrossFit study and how flawed that definition of injury is, needing to see a medical professional and also not being able to sustain your regular physical activity. In this study, each individual paper in the meta-analysis had a different definition of the word injury. Let's take a look at what some of the definitions were. In this first study of novice runners by Bovens et al., the definition of the word injury was any physical complaint developed in relationship with running activities causing restriction in running, distance, speed, duration, and frequency. In an article by Breteweg, butchered that probably, et al., the definition was any musculoskeletal complaint of the lower extremity or lower back causing restriction of running for at least a week. So these are pretty low threshold definitions of the word injury, as you can see. Nowhere near the definition that we would use in the CrossFit study. Remember that in the CrossFit study you needed to see a medical professional. These individuals just had to not sustain their running program for a day. So overall, we can know that if we conducted the same survey and used these two definitions of the term injury, we would know that we would get drastically different answers as far as who had sustained an injury in the last 12 months. Now that we know that there's this flaw in the comparison between the CrossFit study and the running meta-analysis, it's pretty easy to see how someone could create the argument that CrossFit is so safe. Only 0.74 people, or 0.74 injuries occurred every 1,000 hours. Or look over here on this running study, 17 injuries every 1,000 hours. But again, if we just put our common sense hat on and think, well, if your definition is basically you had to stop training for a day, and your definition is you had to see a medical professional, how many times are there days that you have to stop training versus the days that you have to see a medical professional? My guess is that that ratio is pretty high. There's going to be quite a few days that you're not able to train the way that you would like to versus the number of days you actually have to see a medical professional for your condition. That's the key problem we have with the comparison between these two studies. So this individual who created this post, we're not saying that he did this maliciously. He may have just read the abstract and thought to himself, man, this really supports my argument that CrossFit is safe. And we are not necessarily saying that it doesn't. All we're saying is that as professionals in the field, we need to do our research. We have people that follow us for our content and are making training decisions based upon what we say. It behooves us to do the right thing, do our homework, and make sure that we are being objective when using scientific literature. So if you are a consumer, try and be an educated one. If you see claims like this coming through your Facebook feed or Instagram, wherever it might be, digest the content. I'm not saying that you need to go and look into the research yourself, but at the very least take it with a grain of salt and think, does that make sense to me? Does it make sense that CrossFit has 0.74 injuries for every 17 running injury? Thanks for tuning in today, guys. If you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel, hit the notification button so every time we come out with new content, you'll be the first to know about it.